Hey guys, tonight we follow the story of a man whose world was made not of skyscrapers or boardrooms, but of dirt, diesel fumes, and tunnels that breathed like lungs under a divided land. Joaquín El Chapo. Guzmán. Yes, that El Chapo. The farmer's son who carved an empire through corridors and chaos, and somehow kept slipping through cracks big governments didn't know they had. It's 2016. The waves off Los Mochis lap against the coast like they always do. Calm, a little sleepy. But inland, it's anything but peaceful. Marines with bandanas over their faces move with quiet intent. A safehouse door splinters open. Gunfire rattles in a chaotic staccato. And behind a refrigerator, yes, a refrigerator, a tunnel lies waiting once again. Except this time, it ends not in freedom, but in a manhole and handcuffs. The Tunnel King is done digging, for now, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'm curious, where are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? Drop your location and local hour in the comments. I'd love to know. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's hard to say exactly what Joaquín feels when he's pulled from the sewer by Mexican Marines that chilly January morning. He's been here before, in cuffs, caught, cameras flashing like fireworks at an unwanted birthday party. But this time feels different. Maybe it's the cold concrete on his back. Maybe it's the ache of age in his knees. Or maybe it's because, deep down, even he knows this is the final chapter. The raid is fast, surgical. 6 of his men fall in the first wave. Guzmán bolts through the house into the secret passage behind the fridge, a detail so cinematic it might as well come with a popcorn machine. But this is real, and the tunnel, always the tunnel, is his escape valve. He's done it before, beneath prisons, into bathtubs, out of courtrooms. But this time, he doesn't get far. Somewhere beneath the city streets, his getaway car never shows. His right-hand man is already panicking. His phone pings cell towers like breadcrumbs. Hours later, near dawn, they find him trying to blend into the streets like any other night traveler, except his shoes are too clean, his silence too rehearsed. Back at the station, they ask the question everyone expects. Why did you run? And like a man ordering at his favorite diner, he answers flatly, because I knew you'd come. There's no fight, no spectacle, just a shrug, maybe even relief. Joaquín Guzmán has lived too long on borrowed time, and time, like tunnels, always folds in. The world reacts with disbelief and a touch of déjà vu. After all, this isn't his first capture. The media is already writing headlines faster than prosecutors draft charges. The end of an era, they say. But some whisper, is it? With El Chapo, it's never quite the end until the soil settles. And back in Sinaloa, in the mountain villages that raised him, corridos start spinning again. New verses, same beat. Some say he let himself be caught. Some say he lost his edge. But many people still think that his real strength was never in his presence. It was in the void he left behind. Because with El Chapo, even the silence sounds suspicious. Before Joaquín Guzmán became a ghost in sewers and a headline across borders, he was just a boy, barefoot, sunburned, and always one bad harvest away from hunger. Latuna, his hometown in the Sierra Madre, wasn't the kind of place you find on postcards. It clung to the mountain like a stubborn cactus. Dirt roads curved like question marks through hills that whispered secrets to anyone still enough to listen. He was born on April 4, 1957, though even that date dances in shadows. Birth records in the region weren't exactly known for their punctuality. His family worked the land when the land allowed it. His father, Emilio, was a small-scale poppy farmer, cultivating the sticky brown resin that fed the heroin trade long before Joaquín could spell the word cartel. His mother, Maria Consuelo, ran the house like a ship through fog. Strict, quiet, and always moving forward. They had little, and by little, we mean meals that depended on weather and whether or not debts could be pushed to mañana. Joaquín sold oranges as a boy, not for spending money, but for survival. When there were no oranges, he sold whatever grew or whatever could be borrowed and bartered. He had 3 brothers and 4 sisters, and like many in that part of Sinaloa, education was a luxury often replaced by work, quick reflexes, and knowing when not to ask questions. The mountains shaped him, not just his legs, tough from walking miles, but his sense of silence. In the Sierra, you speak when you must. Eyes do most of the talking. Joaquín learned that early. People forget this part. They picture the flashy kingpin with gold-plated guns and fleets of planes. But this was the core. A kid with dirt under his nails and a fierce refusal to be poor forever. He wasn't big, hence El Chapo, meaning shorty. But even young, he had the kind of presence that made other boys let him go first in line, just in case. He knew how to read people. Better yet, he knew how to read the gaps in what they said. One historical detail that often surprises people. During the 1970s, the U.S. government poured money into Mexico's anti-drug operations, which ironically pushed many small-time growers deeper underground and made room for people like Joaquín to build networks in the gaps. The law didn't seal the leaks, it deepened the trenches. By the time he was a teen, he had his own poppy plot. His dad had kicked him out, too rebellious, too demanding. That's how the stories go, at least. Whether that's true or just family folklore wrapped in myth, it's clear that Guzmán was running his own show early. He recruited cousins and friends. He handled money with a paranoia that would later grow into full-blown operational brilliance. They say he once told his uncle, "If I'm going to risk my life, I want to make real money." You can imagine the look he got, equal parts laughter and warning. But he meant it. He saw how the drug game worked. Farmers took the risk. Middlemen skimmed. Buyers made fortunes. He decided not to be a farmer for long. Do you remember the detail about him selling oranges? Years later, his former neighbors would say that same tenacity, the refusal to return with full baskets, was exactly how he ran his empire. He'd rather burn a shipment than give it up for free. He'd rather lose a hand than let it be tied. At night, in Latuna, when the stars painted the mountain edges in cold silver, young Joaquín would lie on a straw mat and listen to the wind carrying the rumble of distant trucks. Traffickers, smugglers, men with options. And that sound? It didn't lull him to sleep. It sharpened his dreams. So what do you think? Was he destined by poverty or drawn by choice? Many people still think that in a place like Latuna, crime isn't just a path. It's the only door that stays open. By the early 1970s, the Mexican drug landscape was changing. Slowly, then all at once. The old routes shifted. American appetites for heroin, marijuana, and eventually cocaine were ballooning faster than any law enforcement agency could comprehend. And in the middle of it, barely 20 and already wiry with ambition, Joaquín Guzmán took his first formal steps into organized crime. The man who opened the first real door for him? Pedro Aviles Perez. a name whispered now. But in his day, the so-called father of Mexican drug trafficking, Aviles had pioneered the use of aircraft to move drugs north. He didn't just play the game. He redrew the board. And Guzmán? He started at the bottom, loading planes, sweeping warehouses, tracking shipments with the precision of someone who didn't plan on staying at the bottom for long. He wasn't a flashy recruit. He listened more than he spoke, asked questions like a schoolboy shadowing a professor, and paid attention to where every dollar landed and every body dropped. When other boys talked about escaping to the cities for music or girls, Joaquín was counting truckloads and weighing risk against reward. There's a moment, likely apocryphal but too poetic to ignore, when he supposedly asked a pilot, "How many kilos fit in that?" And when the pilot shrugged, Joaquín replied, "I'm going to double it." That, folks, is the voice of someone who's not thinking about surviving the week, but conquering the next decade. But Aviles's reign wouldn't last. In 1978, he was gunned down in an ambush many believe was orchestrated not by enemies, but by allies eager to inherit his roots. Among them, a rising star named Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. Now here's a mainstream historical fact. Félix Gallardo was the architect of the so-called Guadalajara cartel, the first true federation of Mexico's major drug traffickers. Instead of fighting, he united them. The system worked like a corporation, shared risks, managed routes, pooled bribes. It was the golden age of narco-diplomacy. And yes, Guzmán saw it all. He slid into the background under Gallardo's expanding shadow, working as a driver and errand runner at first. But it didn't take long for people to notice the short man who never forgot a number and never repeated a mistake. He handled logistics, tight ones. If a shipment was due Friday, it arrived Thursday. If a guard wanted a bribe, Chapo already knew his daughter's name and her favorite brand of sneakers. This wasn't charm, it was data. And it worked. By the early 1980s, Guzmán was managing shipments for Félix Gallardo's network, specifically in the Pacific Corridor. He wasn't flashy, but he was reliable. And in that world, reliability is more valuable than ruthlessness. At least in the beginning. Still, he had to make a name. And sometimes, names require noise. One story still floats around Sinaloa, how a rival crew failed to move a shipment on time. The drugs were seized. The crew vanished. No bodies, no news. Just one quiet message passed around campfires and radio chatter. Don't make El Chapo wait. He was learning from the best. But even then, you could feel him taking notes on what not to do. He saw how Gallardo centralized too much, how vanity made people sloppy, how trusting the wrong cousin could sink an entire region. And so, Joaquín didn't just rise, he prepared. Back home, his family noticed changes. New clothes, new vehicles, a fresh coat of paint on the old house in Latuna. He never abandoned his roots, not fully, but the kid who once sold oranges was now making deals under chandeliers. But there's a cost to rising. Many people still think that Pedro Aviles's death was a warning shot for every upstart who believed loyalty would protect them. So what do you think? Was El Chapo smart, or just lucky to live long enough to outgrow his mentors? One thing's certain. He was no longer watching trucks from a straw mat. He was loading them. By the mid-1980s, Joaquín Guzmán was no longer just another name in the shadows. He was an operator. But he still worked under one man, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the so-called El Padrino, or the Godfather, of Mexico's first unified cartel. And that suited Chapo just fine. For now, Gallardo was a master tactician. He wore suits tailored in Guadalajara and carried himself like a businessman, not a bandit. But don't let the cologne and cufflinks fool you. He ruled with a velvet glove hiding a steel grip. Guzmán, on the other hand, was all grit and gravel. Short, yes, but sharp-eyed. And most importantly, he was obsessed with timing. Gallardo gave him control of the Pacific route, a logistics nightmare full of winding roads, twitchy police, and impatient buyers. To most men, it was a headache. To Chapo, it was a chance to test his gospel. Efficiency equals dominance. At this point in history, the U.S. had become obsessed with stopping the cocaine flood. Reagan's war on drugs was in full swing, and the DEA was everywhere. Airports, ports, even farming villages. It was chaos, perfect cover for someone building something underneath it all. That's when Joaquín made a decision that would define the rest of his career. If the roads were watched, he'd dig his own, tunnels. He didn't invent the concept, but he perfected the practice. Simple at first, just narrow crawl spaces used for marijuana. But by the time Gallardo even realized what was happening, Guzmán's underground empire had arteries stretching under border fences, complete with rail systems, lighting, and airflow. The man was turning the soil into supply chains, but it wasn't just the tunnels. It was how Chapo used time like a weapon. He staggered shipments, rerouted mid-journey, and paid off border guards before they even knew what they were guarding. If someone got caught, he didn't ask why. He asked, how many hours were they late? Even Gallardo's inner circle started to murmur. Who was this short man moving so much weight with so little noise? Why did his routes leak fewer bribes but pull more profit? That brings us to a pivotal moment. In 1989, everything changed. One mainstream historical fact here. In April of that year, DEA-backed Mexican authorities arrested Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. The old king fell, quietly, in his pajamas, marking the end of an era. The cartel federation fractured overnight. What had once been a family became a field of warlords, and in that split second of panic, Guzmán didn't flinch. He already had his team. Ismael El Mayo Zambada, Hector El Güero Palma, and others who believed in timing, logistics, and leverage. They didn't mourn the collapse. They saw it as liberation. Guzmán wasn't just a subordinate anymore. He was the quiet architect of what would become the Sinaloa cartel. So how did he rise so fast without firing a shot? Because he'd already built something stronger than a battalion. He'd built a system, a network that could run even when he slept. Tunnels that didn't need introductions. Buyers who didn't need negotiations. The roads were breaking, but Chapo had gone underground long ago. Do you remember the day he stood by the airstrip, watching shipments go up in smoke after a misstep? He never forgot that. That memory built his empire, and now, as other factions clawed for scraps, Guzmán was already 3 steps ahead, mapping new tunnel entrances, while the others were still mourning the fall of the Godfather. Many people still think that Félix Gallardo underestimated him, that he mistook obedience for weakness. So what do you think? Did Chapo outplay his mentor, or simply wait for the mentor to collapse? Either way, the student was now building his own kingdom, quietly, efficiently, and always below the surface. When a cartel fractures, most men reach for a gun. Joaquín Guzmán? He reached for a calculator and a calendar. The Guadalajara cartel was now scattered into rival factions, each hungry, each territorial, and each paranoid. It was the perfect storm. And Guzmán, ever the minimalist tactician, moved like a shadow through the rubble. With Félix Gallardo behind bars, Guzmán began consolidating territory across Mexico's Pacific coast. He didn't shout about it. He didn't declare war. He simply offered better rates, faster delivery, and tighter security. If you were a buyer, you didn't care whose name was on the flag. You cared that the product arrived on time, uncut, and unbothered by lawmen. Still, not everyone appreciated his subtle approach. The Arellano Felix brothers, Tijuana's brutal ruling family, weren't interested in Guzman's spreadsheets and schedules. They were flash, fury, and gold chains over Hawaiian shirts. And when Sinaloa's roots began brushing too close to theirs, sparks flew. Now let's lock in one historical truth. In 1993, the conflict reached a fever pitch in Guadalajara. Chapo had narrowly escaped an ambush by the Arellano Felix crew. They'd cornered him at a nightclub and riddled the place with bullets. He slipped away, barely. But just a few months later, the retaliation made headlines across the world. It was May 24th, 1993, the Guadalajara airport. A shootout erupted in broad daylight. When the dust settled, 6 were dead, including Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, a holy man gunned down in the crossfire. Or, some allege, mistakenly targeted as Guzmán himself due to a similar car and build. That moment changed everything. The Mexican government couldn't look away anymore. The Catholic Church was outraged. International pressure mounted. Suddenly, Joaquín Guzmán wasn't just another ghost with tunnels. He was public enemy number 1, and for the first time in years, he was on the run. You'd think a man used to slipping through shadows would know how to vanish. And he tried. Across the country, into Guatemala, through villages so remote even maps gave up. But you can only dig so far before the soil pushes back. On June 9th, 1993, Chapo was captured by Guatemalan authorities and handed over to Mexico. No tunnels this time, no getaway car, just cuffs, flashbulbs, and that now familiar look on his face. Unreadable, they sent him to Puente Grande, a high-security prison in Jalisco. And here's where most men would fade. But Guzmán wasn't most men. Inside, he did what he'd always done. He reorganized, shifted loyalties, bribed guards, built a system. You see, Puente Grande wasn't just a prison. For Chapo, it was a temporary office. He wasn't alone either. Inside were old allies like El Güero Palma and new faces looking for guidance. He moved money, coordinated shipments, even arranged killings, all from behind bars. Phones, laptops, food orders. It was a hotel with steel bars. Some say he had a private wing. Others say guards called him Señor. Many people still think that Puente Grande never held him. It simply accommodated him. And so, while the outside world gasped at the airport shootout and debated if Chapo had killed a cardinal, the man himself was already making dinner plans and business deals from a prison cell with better Wi-Fi than most offices. Do you remember how obsessed he was with time? Even here, that trait kept him dangerous. He scheduled meetings with other inmates down to the minute. If a bribe was late, a guard was replaced. If a shipment was delayed, someone's cousin went missing. He never raised his voice. He didn't have to. So what do you think? Was prison a setback or a sabbatical? Many still debate whether his capture in 1993 was a loss at all, or just the next tunnel, because for Guzmán, the walls were never the problem. He'd already figured out how to dig beneath them. Puente Grande, Mexico's so-called maximum security prison, would have been a dead end for almost anyone else. But for Joaquín Guzmán, it was merely a new headquarters, one with guards that served meals like waiters and inmates who lined up to pledge allegiance. If the outside world thought he was caged, the inside world knew better. El Chapo had simply changed the address on his letterhead. From 1993 until 2001, Guzmán ran his operation from within those concrete walls, and not with subtlety either. Rumors swirled that he had his own private quarters, complete with a TV, gourmet food, and conjugal visits that felt less like privileges and more like entitlements. One report even claims he wore a pager connected to corrupt staff, allowing him to summon anyone he pleased. But beneath the gossip, the real empire kept humming. Orders still flowed from prison. Drugs still moved. Enemies still vanished. And all the while, Joaquín kept playing the long game. You remember his obsession with precision, right? Inside Puente Grande, it crystallized. He kept ledgers in code, memorized schedules down to the minute, and held meetings as punctual as train station departures. He'd built a corporate structure behind bars, and the guards, they were simply on payroll, and yet the clock kept ticking. Nearly 8 years in, the balance began to shift. The Mexican government was under growing international pressure, especially from the United States, to demonstrate real control over its prisons and drug trafficking. The whispers started turning into investigations. The luxury started attracting attention, so Guzmán did what Guzmán always did. He planned his exit. Now, let's talk about one of the most infamous escapes in modern criminal history. The laundry cart escape. It's February 2001. Guards are changing shifts, lights flicker, hallways quiet, and somewhere between the kitchen and the courtyard, a rolling cart filled with dirty laundry is pushed through a locked gate without inspection. Inside, Joaquín Guzmán, folded like a secret, silent as ever. He doesn't run. He's driven. Right out of the front gates, through a system greased with bribes, loyalty, and a very precise sense of timing. Many people still think the escape wasn't an escape at all, but a handoff. So, what do you think? Did he sneak out, or was he walked out like a departing guest? Either way, the result was the same. El Chapo was free again, and when word broke, it echoed like thunder. Not just in Mexico, but across Washington, Bogota, Madrid. This wasn't just a fugitive. It was a man who'd escaped the grasp of the very systems meant to contain him. What did he do next? He disappeared. Completely. Into the mountains of Sinaloa, into the forests and safe houses of Durango, into the folklore of northern Mexico. Authorities searched. The DEA fumed, but he was always one bend ahead. Every raid turned up nothing. Every tip led to a village already evacuated, and while the world chased him, he got back to work. But this wasn't the same Guzmán who had built his name under Gallardo. This was Chapo reborn. Post-prison, he stopped playing second. He wasn't just managing routes anymore. He was commanding alliances, appointing regional bosses, and consolidating power like a boardroom strategist with a machete under the desk. He expanded operations into Central America, strengthened ties with Colombian suppliers, streamlined smuggling across multiple borders, air, land, and of course, underground, because the tunnels were back. And this time, they weren't just clever. They were breathtaking. Reinforced walls, motorized carts, GPS guidance. One even had ventilation and neon lighting, and he used them not just for drugs, but for people, weapons, and messages. The border, once a barrier, became a suggestion. Guzmán had turned geography into a loophole. By 2004, the Sinaloa cartel had evolved from a regional syndicate into a multinational empire. And yet, its architect remained a ghost, absent from cameras, absent from chatter, yet always present in outcome. So, do you remember that laundry cart? That quiet roll through a gate meant to be locked? That wasn't just an escape. That was a statement that he decided when the story changed chapters. Not the courts, not the guards, not the headlines. By the mid-2000s, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán wasn't just back, he was ascending into legend. While law enforcement agencies traded satellite photos and whispered coordinates, Guzmán tightened his grip on the western corridors of Mexico. From Sinaloa to Sonora and into Chihuahua's jagged arteries, the map of northern Mexico was quietly tilting in his favor. And the secret wasn't blood, it was efficiency. The tunnels, of course, were his signature. He didn't invent cross-border drug tunnels, but he made them elegant, industrial, quiet. While others relied on bribed customs officers or disguised trucks, Guzmán burrowed beneath all of it. One of the most famous tunnels at the time connected a warehouse in Tijuana to a nondescript building in San Diego. It was half a mile long, with reinforced walls, electric lighting, and rails for motorized carts. It didn't smuggle. It shipped. Imagine this. A worker in Sinaloa loads product into a crate. That crate disappears into the earth and, within hours, emerges on U.S. soil, untouched, unseen. No chase, no firefight. Just a gentle hum beneath the border. And above ground? Chapo kept the illusion intact. He diversified, produced businesses, shipping companies, fronts that moved jalapenos and pineapples, but never smelled like anything other than diesel and dollar signs. His operation wasn't loud. It was quiet, like a ticking watch, but not everyone appreciated the silence. The 2000s were also the years of open cartel warfare. While Guzmán consolidated his underground empire, rivals above ground began baring teeth. Chief among them? Los Zetas. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Los Zetas were originally formed by defectors from Mexico's elite military units. They brought discipline, tactics, and a taste for extreme violence. Where Guzmán's operations were quiet, Los Zetas went loud. Executions, dismemberments, public displays meant to terrify. Inevitably, the two collided, and when they did, Guzmán adapted again. He didn't try to outshout Los Zetas. He simply outmaneuvered them. His lieutenants would bribe a mayor while Los Zetas kidnapped him. He'd offer a town stability while the others offered fear. He didn't need to win every battle. He just needed the money to keep flowing. And oh, did it flow. By 2009, Forbes listed El Chapo among the world's billionaires. Think about that. A man with no listed address, no government job, no LinkedIn profile, but enough cash, real estate, and international reach to make the list. Many people still think the number was higher, by billions. So what do you think? Was Forbes exposing the truth or underestimating it? One thing is certain. Money insulated him. He funded roads, schools, even soccer fields in rural villages. In places where the government showed up only to take, Chapo gave. In the Sierra Madre, people didn't ask if he was good or bad. They asked if he was fair. Do you remember the young boy who once sold oranges? In those hills, his name now echoed in church pews and schoolyards. Songs were written. Corridos, Mexican ballads, sang his praises, painting him as a Robin Hood with a satellite phone. But not all stories are soft. When an associate failed to deliver a shipment, he was tied to a tree, left for the vultures. When a rival crew snatched one of Chapo's cousins, 5 heads arrived in a cooler the next day. No note needed. Still, Guzmán didn't advertise this side. He let others brag. He let his tunnels speak. There's one lesser-known tale, whispered among his drivers, how Chapo once redesigned an entire smuggling route because the previous road passed too close to a school. No kids, he supposedly said. Too many questions. Scholars argue whether it's true or just part of the myth-making. But that's the thing about El Chapo. Truth and legend grew together like roots underground. So what made his tunnels more than tunnels? Maybe it was this. In a world built on walls and gates and checkpoints, Guzmán saw below. Where others hit barriers, he saw doorways. While soldiers pointed rifles at highways, his empire flowed beneath their boots. And even now, some of those tunnels haven't been found. By the time the world finally caught up to Joaquín Guzmán again in 1993, it had been a long, winding chase through back roads, betrayal, and backdoor deals. But when the headlines declared El Chapo captured, what most didn't realize was that the man was just beginning to blueprint the next stage of his life. Inside Puente Grande, he learned how to scale. But it was in the years following that his empire turned into a juggernaut. Let's revisit the moment of his first capture, not the chaos of the shootout, but the eerie quiet afterward. You remember the scene. A Guatemalan police convoy handing him over, flashbulbs illuminating a face that didn't seem surprised, only slightly amused. Behind the expressions and the restraints was a man already running calculations. Not if he'd escape, but how soon. And when he did finally roll out of prison inside a laundry cart in 2001, the world laughed, as if the whole thing had been a prank pulled on a nation. But for Guzmán, that cart might as well have been a coronation coach, because from the moment his boots hit free soil again, the world he re-entered wasn't the same one he'd left. His name now carried weight beyond Sinaloa. The myth had outgrown the man, and with that came leverage, money, alliances, silence. He returned not to chaos, but to a structure already waiting. His lieutenants, many of whom had kept the gears oiled in his absence, welcomed him back not with questions, but with reports. Routes expanded, markets opened. The Sinaloa cartel was no longer regional. It was a continent-spanning transnational business. And now, its CEO was back at the helm. From 2001 to 2008, Chapo oversaw one of the most aggressive expansions in cartel history. Cocaine poured in from Colombia, routed through Central America, hidden in everything from engine blocks to frozen mango pulp. Meth labs popped up like weeds across Mexico's interior. And heroin? It flowed too. Black tar and white powder, destined for American veins. But the real marvel was his ability to coordinate logistics like a supply chain manager from hell. Boats off Baja, planes landing on dirt strips in the Sonoran Desert, human mules walking through heat waves in Arizona, even freight trains, containers brimming with legal cargo masking the scent of millions in contraband. Now here's a historical data point. Between 2006 and 2012, the Mexican government launched an unprecedented military campaign against the cartels. Under President Felipe Calderón, over 60,000 troops were deployed across the country in what came to be known as Mexico's drug war. But for all the firepower and funding, Guzmán didn't just survive, he thrived. His rivals, like the Beltran Leyva organization, fractured under pressure. Others were caught in turf wars. But Sinaloa, it stayed agile. Do you know how? Because Chapo wasn't micromanaging. It wasn't about his hand on every lever. It was about design. Like a watchmaker who builds a timepiece so precise that even if one gear breaks, the hands still move. But not all wounds were avoidable. In 2008, Guzmán's oldest son, Edgar Guzmán Lopez, was gunned down in Culiacán. It was a brutal hit. Over 500 bullets riddled the parking lot where he stood. Some blamed rival factions, others suspected betrayal within. And in the weeks that followed, Sinaloa's retaliation wasn't loud. It was surgical. A series of quiet disappearances, nighttime explosions, and eerie silences left messages far louder than press releases. Chapo rarely spoke of his losses, but those close to him said Edgar's death changed him, not in his business strategy, but in the eyes. Colder, more calculating, less patient. Do you remember the old man who used to time deliveries down to the minute? Now he timed revenge. He also tightened his inner circle. Fewer face-to-face meetings, more messages sent through layers of trusted couriers. He stopped appearing at public gatherings, and when he did move, it was like a ghost caravan. Decoys, blindfolded drivers, and GPS signals bouncing across towers like static. Many people still think that in those years, he was never more than an hour away from American soil, yet completely untouchable. So what do you think? Was it luck? Or did he simply understand terrain better than any general? Either way, the man who had once escaped in a laundry cart was now disappearing without a trace. No tunnels needed. By the early 2010s, Joaquín Guzmán wasn't just running a cartel. He was managing an empire that defied geography, governments, and even gravity. From Colombia to Chicago, his web reached into neighborhoods, warehouses, and bank accounts. Yet the man himself remained invisible, like a rumor with a face. He moved with precision, never sleeping in the same place twice, often staying underground, both literally and metaphorically. And if you're wondering whether that's just myth, here's your mainstream historical fact. By this point, Guzmán owned and operated a complex network of underground bunkers, safe houses, and tunnel-connected residences throughout Sinaloa. One of the most well-known was a house in Culiacán, with a bathtub that slid away to reveal a ladder descending into a secret tunnel, one that connected to the city's sewer system and ultimately opened miles away in the countryside. Yes, that's how he lived, like a man who turned his fear into architecture. And why such elaborate exits? Because law enforcement was no longer watching from a distance. They were closing in. The DEA, the Mexican Marines, Interpol. Everyone wanted a piece of the man who had made a mockery of borders and bars. Still, Chapo stayed one step ahead. He shifted between mountain hideouts and city havens with military precision. His men used encrypted radios, burner phones, and codes layered so deep they made spy agencies blush. Even within his own organization, few knew his exact location at any given moment. The legend was now his greatest camouflage. But that level of paranoia comes at a cost. He rarely saw his children. His wives and girlfriends were hidden away in layers of protection. His meetings were short, curt, transactional. One former associate claimed you could measure trust in Chapo's circle by how many seconds he let you look him in the eye. And still the business thrived. Every week, product moved by sea, by land, by air, and of course, by tunnel. And if one method faltered, 5 others picked up the slack. Shipments of chili peppers and avocados were packed with cocaine. Human couriers carried heroin sewn into clothing linings. Freight trains were loaded with meth hidden inside fake engine parts. He didn't need to know every detail. He just needed to know the system still breathed. You remember how obsessed he was with timing? That didn't change. Associates were expected to arrive early or not at all. If a pilot radioed in a delay, another plane was already airborne. Chapo didn't wait for problems. He replaced them. But one problem couldn't be replaced. Power makes you visible. And in 2012, visibility came knocking again. American agencies, working with Mexican authorities, began using a different tactic. Instead of chasing Chapo, they chased his phones. Not his phone, mind you. He changed numbers more often than socks. But they started tracking his associates, then their associates. It was like watching water flow downhill. Eventually, It pooled in one place. In early 2014, that place was Mazatlan. Now, do you remember that bathtub? On the night of February 22nd, 2014, the Mexican Navy burst into a nondescript beachfront condo. There, they found Guzmán asleep with his wife and twin daughters. No shootout, no tunnel dash, just surprise and resignation. He tried to slip away. Behind the bathtub was that now famous tunnel entrance. But the Marines knew. They'd blocked the exits. He was cornered. This time there was no escape cart. Just a man, shirtless and barefoot, led away in handcuffs. The world erupted. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted. The U.S. requested extradition. Mexican officials called it a major victory. But in the hills of Sinaloa, no one believed it would last. Many people still think that Guzmán let himself be caught, either to avoid betrayal or as part of a bigger plan. So what do you think? Was it a slip-up or strategy? Because if history had taught us anything by then, it was this. You don't count El Chapo out until the tunnel is filled in. For the second time in his long, elusive dance with law enforcement, Joaquín Guzmán found himself behind bars. This time, the cell was inside Altiplano, Mexico's highest security prison, a fortress designed with thick concrete, armed watchtowers, motion sensors, and miles of camera wiring. The authorities were confident. After all, this wasn't Puente Grande, with its bribe-friendly guards and laundry cart exits. This was different, but so was Chapo. In public, the Mexican government called it the end of an era. Press conferences buzzed with victory. U.S. officials nodded solemnly and leaned on podiums. But in private, there were doubts, and rightly so. Because if there's one thing Guzmán knew better than cocaine pricing or border patrol schedules, it was systems. And any system, even Altiplano, had a crack somewhere. The countdown began the moment he was fingerprinted. Let's pause for a moment on Altiplano. Built to contain men like Guzmán, it was supposed to be inescapable. Cells were monitored 24/7, doors locked with magnetic bolts, guards rotated randomly. Even the showers were outfitted with surveillance. But all those precautions had one flaw. They assumed he'd play by the rules of the surface. He didn't. While most prisoners passed time with cards or telenovelas, Chapo observed, measured, dug in, mentally first, then literally. His plan, a tunnel of course, it sounds absurd until you see how it was done. Engineers hired by his associates purchased a nearby property, an unremarkable construction site over a mile from the prison walls. Over months, they tunneled directly under the cell block. The passage was ventilated, lit, and wide enough for a motorcycle mounted on rails. Yes, a motorcycle. This wasn't a scramble through dirt. This was a subterranean freeway. Now, here's your mainstream historical fact. On the night of July 11, 2015, surveillance cameras inside Guzmán's cell showed him walking behind a blind spot in the shower area. Moments later, he was gone. Gone. No struggle. No alarms. Just one man stepping into the floor and vanishing beneath Mexico. The response? Immediate chaos. The government froze. News anchors gasped. It was déjà vu dipped in disbelief. He did it again. But if you've been paying attention, you weren't surprised. Do you remember his bathtub tunnel in Culiacan? This was just that. Evolved. Engineered to perfection. He emerged a mile away, climbed onto a waiting motorcycle, and disappeared into the countryside. And the humiliation? It was international. Officials stumbled over excuses. Heads rolled. Investigations were launched into who knew what and when. But the damage was done. Guzmán wasn't just free. He was ascendant. His legend, now cemented in concrete and tunnel dust, had outpaced his file number once again. And in Sinaloa, celebrations. Villages set off fireworks. Narco ballads updated their lyrics overnight. The king of the underground was back, and this time, they said, he wouldn't be caught. But the man himself? He didn't gloat. He went back to work. The escape was brilliant, but it brought heat. Every agency turned its eyes to the mountains. Satellites scanned treetops. Surveillance drones buzzed like insects. And so, Guzmán receded again, into fortified ranches, into forests, into the belly of the earth. His operations resumed within days. Cocaine rerouted, meth labs reactivated, but his communications grew even more secretive. Messages now passed only through verified couriers. Cell phones were taboo. Even eye contact, some say, was discouraged unless absolutely necessary. Still, the one variable Chapo couldn't control was vanity. You see, around this time, he began talking to a certain Mexican actress, Kate del Castillo. Their correspondence was bold, even poetic. And when actor Sean Penn got involved, the meeting turned from fantasy to fatal flaw. More on that later. But for now, just remember, while the world scrambled for answers, Guzmán was already planning the next phase. He didn't see walls. He saw walls as temporary packaging. Obstacles were just delays with bad lighting. Many people still think his second escape made him untouchable. But what do you think? Was it brilliance? Or was the world simply too slow to catch up? One thing's for sure. When he disappeared from that prison cell, it wasn't just the cameras that blinked. The world did. By late 2015, Joaquín Guzmán had become something more than a drug lord. He was a symbol, a whispered name on both sides of the border. To some, he was a villain who'd outwitted two governments and smeared blood across the map of Mexico. To others, he was an outlaw genius, a folk hero with dirt under his nails and helicopters on his tail. But to Guzmán, he was just back to business, fresh from his second escape. The pressure should have crushed him. And yet, in typical fashion, he adapted. His movements became even more unpredictable. He no longer stayed in ranches for more than a few nights. Meetings were scheduled at the last minute, then moved again, sometimes to mountaintop clearings accessible only by mules. His inner circle shrank to men who'd proven loyalty with silence and scars. Do you remember the old tunnels? The ones carved like arteries beneath cities and prisons? Well, they'd evolved. Now, Guzmán's hideouts came with hatches in the floor, panic tunnels leading to thick foliage or storm drains, complete with air systems and pressure-triggered collapse points, so no one could follow. Meanwhile, his enemies were multiplying. The Sinaloa cartel, once united under his quiet leadership, had begun to stretch thin. With Chapo always on the run, regional bosses got bolder. Ismael El Mayo Zambada held down operations in the coastal strongholds, but younger players, El Cholo Ivan, Damaso Lopez Núñez, started carving out their own fiefdoms. Some claimed to speak for Chapo. Others waited to see if he would fall, and while internal friction simmered, the government doubled its efforts. Mexican Marines working closely with U.S. intelligence narrowed their focus. No more wide net, just precision tracking, wiretaps, and drones. And the one thing that helped them most? Chapo's curiosity. Let's talk about that now infamous chapter, the interview. Through a string of encrypted messages, Guzmán had reached out to Mexican actress Kate del Castillo. He admired her. She had played a cartel boss on television, a queen pin in heels and shadows. Maybe he saw a mirror. Maybe he was bored. Either way, their flirtation turned into logistics. He invited her to meet. She said yes, and brought a +1, actor Sean Penn. Yes, that's Sean Penn. The meeting took place deep in the jungle. There was wine, laughter, photographs. Guzmán, ever the host, welcomed them with grilled food and bodyguards barely pretending not to eavesdrop. It was part surreal, part cinematic, like a movie that didn't know it was real. Now, here's your mainstream historical fact. The interview, intended for Rolling Stone magazine, never went to print in its original form. But the digital footprint left behind, text messages, GPS pings, intercepted chatter, was pure gold for intelligence agencies. Penn went home. Del Castillo returned to her spotlight. But Chapo, he'd left a scent trail. Many people still think that meeting sealed his fate. So what do you think? Was it arrogance or loneliness? Regardless, the trap had been set. In January 2016, authorities finally got the break they needed. Word reached them that Chapo had holed up in Los Mochis, a coastal city known for seafood, sunsets, and now, as the place where the Tunnel King would take his last stroll. Mexican Marines surrounded the house. It was dark, early. Drones buzzed above. On the ground, black-clad men moved like shadows. Then, a crash. A flash. Gunfire erupted in chaotic bursts. Chapo's guards fell. He darted through the house, into the bathroom, down, yes, into another tunnel. But this time the tunnel didn't save him. His escape route led into the city's sewers, filthy and flooded. He emerged blocks away, soaked, exhausted. He tried to steal a car, got caught, tried to talk his way out of it. But the officers recognized him. They made the call, and just like that, he was back in custody. Third time, but this time, it felt different. There was no smirk, no shrug, just a slow blink. As if, deep down, even he knew. This wasn't a delay, this was an ending. The arrest in Los Mochis didn't just send ripples through Mexico, it made headlines around the globe. For the third time, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán had been captured. But this time, no one called it a hiccup. No one said, "See you soon." This time, the tone shifted. The legend was still breathing, but the air around it had grown cold. You remember the sewer crawl, right? The frantic flight through grime and concrete, followed by the stolen car attempt and the look on his face when the officer recognized him. That wasn't the look of a man outwitted. It was the look of someone realizing the margin for error had finally vanished. Once in custody, the Mexican government acted quickly. He was sent back to Altiplano, the very fortress he'd escaped from less than a year earlier. Only this time, the terms had changed. His cell was now a fortress within a fortress. More cameras, more guards, motion sensors beneath the floor, and just for good measure, the shower corner, the one blind spot, was now in full view. They called it El Chapo Proofed. A bit smug, perhaps, but for the moment, accurate. Meanwhile, his empire paused, but only for a breath. Operations continued, shipments moved, lieutenants adjusted. The machine he'd built was never designed to stop. That was the genius of his leadership. He created a structure that didn't collapse when the top was removed. It just swayed, corrected itself, and kept pushing forward. But back in his cell, Guzmán was restless. He knew what was coming. The Americans wanted him. Badly. The U.S. Justice Department had prepared multiple indictments in several districts. Brooklyn, Chicago, Miami, El Paso, all naming him as the architect behind massive drug operations that stretched from jungle labs to suburban neighborhoods. Extradition was no longer a hypothetical. It was inevitable. Inside Altiplano, Guzmán fought it. His lawyers filed motions, cited technicalities, argued that he'd be denied fair treatment. but the walls were closing in. And perhaps, for the first time in his life, the tunnels had run out. Let's talk for a moment about how he changed the business. Because whether you admire or revile him, the truth is, Joaquín Guzmán transformed the drug trade. He turned what was once a disorganized, brutal street game into a multinational enterprise. He structured trafficking like FedEx routes. He used legal entities to mask illegal activity. He fostered a hierarchy that functioned even during his long absences. And he did it all while avoiding photographs, credit cards, and anything else that might place him on the grid. That's not charisma, that's calculation. But power brings vulnerability. During those final months at Altiplano, he communicated less and less, not by choice. Surveillance was tight. Every visitor was monitored, every letter copied. His world had shrunk to the size of his cell, and for a man who once rode helicopters over coca fields and stood barefoot in the halls of his own hidden compounds, that kind of compression wears the soul thin. His health began to decline. Sleep became erratic. He complained of anxiety. His lawyers claimed he was suffering sensory deprivation. He'd pace his cell like a lion in a box too small to turn in. And so, in January 2017, exactly 1 year after his last arrest, Mexico approved his extradition. In the dark hours of January 19th, he was placed aboard a plane bound for New York City. The timing was not accidental. It was the eve of Donald Trump's inauguration. A symbolic moment. The most wanted trafficker, delivered like a trophy, just as a new administration stepped into power. No cameras, no corridor waves, just Guzmán, shackled, head down, eyes forward. He landed at MacArthur Airport in New York and was immediately transferred to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, a facility designed for high-risk inmates. And his new room, smaller than any tunnel he ever built. Many people still think that extradition was the one thing he truly feared, that he never minded prison as long as it was Mexican. So what do you think? Was the final capture his undoing? Or had the walls been closing long before? Either way, the man who once slipped beneath borders and barbed wire was now sealed in concrete, facing a trial that would peel back every layer of his myth. The Tunnel King had reached a place where no digging could save him. Once on U.S. soil, Joaquín Guzmán lost the last bit of control he'd clung to. In Mexico, prisons could be negotiated, walls bent, rules softened, guards bribed. But in the United States, the walls were thicker and the silence was institutional, not tactical. He was placed in solitary confinement at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Lower Manhattan, MCC, known for housing high-profile federal defendants. His cell? 8 feet by 10. A narrow slit for a window. Lights always on. No visitors, no calls, and the only voices he heard belonged to guards who never answered his questions. For a man used to commanding corridors that ran beneath cities, the concrete cube was a coffin without nails. But even while sealed away, his legend roared on. The trial was coming. And not just any trial. It would be, as the media dubbed it, the trial of the century. And when you look at the logistics, it's hard to disagree. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The U.S. District Court in Brooklyn prepared for unprecedented security. Jurors would remain anonymous. Armed guards would escort them to and from the courthouse. The courtroom was surrounded by barricades and surveillance teams. Guzmán himself was brought in through underground tunnels each day. Ironic, really. The man who built his world beneath the earth now moved like a rat through government-built burrows. And what a courtroom it was. The prosecution had mountains of evidence. Wiretaps, testimonies, seized ledgers, photos, and 14 cooperating witnesses, many of them his former associates, bodyguards, even partners. The stories they told were brutal, bizarre, and sometimes chillingly casual. One bodyguard recounted how Guzmán personally executed rivals, then ordered them dumped in flaming pits. Another described secret meetings with government officials, allegedly bought with envelopes thicker than Bibles. Others painted scenes of orgies, bribes, betrayals, and enough coke to glaze a runway. Guzmán's reaction? Mostly, he just stared. Occasionally, he smirked. Once or twice, he leaned over to whisper something to his lawyer. But for the most part, he sat still, dressed in a suit, hair trimmed, listening to a parade of men he once trusted, now using his name like a stepping stone out of their own sentences. And then there was the infamous "I was the boss of bosses" moment. During the trial, one witness, former associate Jesus Zambada Garcia, testified that Guzmán had bragged openly about being the top boss of the Sinaloa cartel. Not one of them. The one. It was a declaration that had long been debated by analysts, journalists, and academics. Many people still think he wasn't the supreme leader, that Sinaloa functioned more like a syndicate with shared power between Chapo, El Mayo Zambada, and others. So what do you think? Was he the CEO or the front man? The prosecution leaned hard into the former. They painted him not as a tool of the system, but its architect. A man who ordered executions by satellite phone, who negotiated shipments like a stockbroker, played countries against each other like pawns, and walked away from firefights smiling. The defense, meanwhile, tried to argue that Guzmán was a scapegoat, a man turned into a myth by media and prosecutors eager for a trophy. They hinted that El Mayo was the real boss, that the government's witnesses were liars trading stories for lighter sentences. But when you stack myth on myth, someone ends up buried. The trial lasted 3 months. During that time, Chapo sat through more than 200 hours of testimony, watched as maps, photos, and emails were presented like chapters in a novel. His wife, Emma Coronel Iceburo, sat in the gallery each day, calm, composed, sometimes even smiling at him across the room. And then came the verdict. February 12, 2019, guilty on all 10 counts, including engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise, drug trafficking, money laundering, and firearms offenses. The decision wasn't just a conviction, it was a closure of something mythic, like watching the final page of a book write itself. Guzmán showed little emotion, just a slight nod, as if to say, "So this is how it ends." Not with tunnels, but testimony. He was transferred to ADX Florence shortly after, the so-called Alcatraz of the Rockies, a supermax prison buried in the mountains of Colorado. And there, he would spend the rest of his life. No cell phones, no messages, no visitors other than lawyers. The man who had once controlled billions in product and payrolls now stared at a concrete wall for 23 hours a day. Do you remember the boy in Latuna selling oranges with scraped knees? He'd carved tunnels under borders, run operations across continents, escaped from prison twice. But in the end, even gravity had caught up. No helicopters, no false walls, just silence. And for once, he had no way out. ADX Florence doesn't look like much from the sky. Just beige concrete nestled in the lonely sprawl of Florence, Colorado, surrounded by fence lines and shadows. But on the ground, it's a different story. This is the end of the road for the worst of the worst. Terrorists, assassins, cartel bosses. And now, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán. His new cell measures 7 by 12 feet. There's a concrete slab for a bed, a desk molded into the wall, and a toilet sink combo. The window is 4 inches wide, facing a concrete barrier that lets in daylight but no view. No tunnels, no whispers through shower pipes. Just air that doesn't move and silence that doesn't forgive. Here's your historical fact. ADX Florence operates under Special Administrative Measures, or SAMs, restrictions designed to isolate inmates completely. No outside contact, no unmonitored phone calls, no communication, period, unless through pre-approved legal teams. Even letters are screened, copied, and delayed. This was the new reality for Guzmán. He'd ruled from caves and condos, from prisons with private chefs and safe houses with escape hatches. But now, even his thoughts had nowhere to go. Inside, routine rules everything. Wake up at dawn, lights on. 1 hour of solitary recreation, inside a slightly larger concrete box, sometimes with a sliver of sky above. Meals delivered through a slot, mail censored, human contact rare. The other 23 hours, alone with memory. You'd think the man who built an empire on isolation might thrive in it. But no, even Guzmán showed signs of unraveling. His lawyers reported paranoia, anxiety, insomnia. He'd walk circles in his cell until his feet swelled. He claimed the guards were taunting him, that the walls were whispering. Whether it was performance or the slow bend of truth under pressure, it didn't matter. The outside world had moved on. No more news flashes, no ballads. The name El Chapo had become a tag for Netflix shows and tabloid retrospectives. But back in Mexico, that was a different story. The Sinaloa cartel didn't die with its patriarch's sentencing. In fact, it adapted. Chapo's sons, Ivan Archivaldo, Jesus Alfredo, and Ovidio, collectively known as Los Chapitos, began asserting more control. Each had been raised in the game. Each had something to prove. They didn't rule like their father. No tunnels, no secret bathtubs. Their power came with iPhones and Instagram. Flashier, riskier, but effective. And then there was El Mayo Zambada, still free, still powerful. Many believe he'd always been the true strategist, the one who knew when to let the spotlight fall elsewhere. He didn't attend court. He didn't grant interviews. He simply stayed moving. So was Chapo ever really the boss of it all? Many people still think he was the muscle, not the mind. So what do you think? Was he the architect, or just the poster boy who built the walls while others plotted in silence? The truth may never be known. What is known is this: the drugs never stopped. Neither did the money. The war on narcotics has shifted terrain, but the roots remain. And the tunnels? They still exist. Some abandoned, others still breathing with life. Whispered about, feared, admired, cemented as part of the modern mythos. Even today, Border Patrol agents stumble upon new ones, engineered with precision, complete with elevators, oxygen, power generators. They're no longer just passageways, they're inheritance. Chapo may be gone, but the system he refined endures. He didn't just smuggle drugs, he smuggled methods. A blueprint passed down in cement and code. Back in Florence, Guzmán remained sealed in silence. No cell phones, no tunnels, no exit plans. But do you remember that moment when he disappeared behind the prison shower in 2015? When the camera lost sight of him for just 12 seconds? That was the moment his legend became something else. Immortal. Because even now, even here, even locked beneath the Rockies, some guards still glance at the walls just to make sure. Outside the heavy doors of ADX Florence, the world shifts as it always does. Elections change, borders tighten, technology races ahead. But inside cell 118, time does not pass. It drips. Joaquín Guzmán, once the most hunted man on earth, now lives by a clock that isn't on the wall, but buried in his head. Wake, eat, walk, sleep, repeat. Not freedom, Not even containment. Just compression. There's no music, no laughter. The soundscape is mechanical. A vent humming, footsteps in distant corridors, a tray sliding through a slot. It's a silence that doesn't soothe, only amplifies thought. And that, more than anything, might be the punishment. Too much memory in too little space. They say he sometimes speaks aloud, to no one in particular, that he traces the lines of his palm as if reading old blueprints. That when it rains, he listens harder, like a man who once measured storms by how much mud they brought to a tunnel mouth, and maybe he does. Because while the rest of the world remembers him as a trafficker, a monster, a myth, he remembers differently. He remembers being 10, kicking dust through Latuna with a pocket full of orange peels and no shoes. He remembers the first time he saw a kilo wrapped tight like a gift. The first time someone called him Senor. The first time someone didn't come back from a delivery, and how quickly he learned not to ask why. He remembers how it felt to disappear through a trap door, heart pounding, not with fear, but with calculation. He remembers being needed. Now no one knocks. Letters come sometimes. Legal documents. The occasional prayer card. He doesn't read them. Not because he can't, but because they remind him the world is still moving. And when the world moves without you, it carves around your absence like water around stone. Do you remember how obsessed he was with efficiency, with schedules, delivery windows, punctuality? Now, he has no appointments, no shipments to track, no one waiting on the other end of a call. Just days, stacked like bricks, one after the other. His health isn't what it was. The man who once disappeared through sewers and hiked mountains barefoot now takes slow, measured steps during his 1 hour of exercise. He circles the same concrete pen, eyes scanning nothing, legs remembering everything. Sometimes a guard watches from the window, unsure if Guzmán is pacing or counting. He still has his pride, though. He refuses to show weakness. He eats everything on the tray. He looks everyone in the eye. He still keeps track of time, not in minutes, but in moments. Like when a guard lingers half a second longer, or when the lights flicker and stay dark just a beat too long, or when he dreams of dirt under his fingernails again. So what do you think? Is he forgotten, or simply paused? Because many people still think that even now, deep beneath the Colorado rock, his presence echoes in Sinaloa, that the system he built still takes its shape from his habits, that lieutenants still whisper his phrases like liturgy, that his ghost still sits at the head of the table, even if the chair is empty. But whether he's remembered or not, whether he was the mastermind or the mask, Joaquín Guzmán is where no tunnel leads and no ladder climbs. He is still, for the first time, truly still. The second escape wasn't supposed to happen. Not in 2015. Not at Altiplano. Not after all the speeches and the reinforced walls and the claims of victory. But then again, Joaquín Guzmán had never concerned himself with what was supposed to happen. He only ever focused on what could. The planning had begun long before the world even knew he'd be captured again. Some say the blueprint for the tunnel had been discussed months earlier, while he was still a free man, hidden somewhere in the mountains of Sinaloa. He knew the risks. He knew the noise his presence created. So he prepared the way he always had, not with gunfire or speeches, but with shovels, patience, and engineering. This tunnel, unlike the escape from Puente Grande in 2001, wasn't an improvisation. It wasn't a gamble. It was architecture born from obsession, from a warehouse over a mile away, A passage was carved with meticulous precision. Ventilation systems were installed. Lights were strung across the ceiling. And on rails, a modified motorcycle, cut down to fit the tunnel's width, waited, greased and ready. The entry point? A blind spot under the shower in Guzmán's prison cell. Now let's revisit that day, July 11, 2015. Altiplano's surveillance camera shows him pacing, calm as ever. He sits, then rises. He walks to the shower corner, just out of sight, as he always had. And then, he doesn't come back. Minutes pass, then alarms. But by then, the silence had already swallowed him. Underground, the tunnel was cool, damp, and humming faintly with electric current. He rode the motorcycle like a delivery man with somewhere to be. When he emerged through the floor of the construction site, fresh clothes and getaway cars waited. Above ground, panic. In Mexico City, phones rang without pause. In Washington, there was disbelief. The U.S. had just renewed demands for extradition, and now he was gone. Many people still think this was no escape at all, but a handoff. So what do you think? Was this a masterpiece of logistics or a silent agreement in high places? Because to pull something like that off, under 24-hour surveillance, in one of the most secure prisons in Latin America, requires more than cunning. It requires collaboration, complicity, and a whole lot of money. Within hours, Guzmán had vanished into the countryside. The search began immediately. But this wasn't 1993 anymore. Technology had changed. The DEA used satellites, heat sensors, drone surveillance. The Mexican Marines were on high alert. Guzmán moved, but the net tightened with every whisper. And still, the man had his rituals. Safe houses were pre-stocked with medicine, clothes, communications gear. The tunnels were only one layer of his mobility. There were fake IDs, corrupted police units, families who owed him favors, and always the mountain. You remember the Sierra Madre, right? The same highlands that raised him now sheltered him. There were paths only locals knew, valleys where even helicopters got lost, and watchmen posted at every entrance. These were not employees. These were loyalists. But this escape was different from the last. In 2001, he had time. He had space. In 2015, the heat was constant. Every movement risked exposure. And then, vanity called. Through a strange twist of ego, timing, and romantic curiosity, Guzmán initiated contact with Kate del Castillo. Her role as a narco queen on Mexican television had caught his eye. Their conversations became flirtatious, then logistical. He wanted to meet. She agreed, and she brought Sean Penn. You remember the jungle interview? Guzmán grinning beside an actor and a soap opera queen. The photos that shouldn't exist. The GPS pings from text messages. That moment, that misstep, may have unraveled the entire plan, because while the meeting itself was secret, the digital footprints were not. Intelligence agencies followed them like breadcrumbs. Suddenly, safe houses that had once been invisible were compromised. Phone numbers, burner devices, all began to illuminate. The Tunnel King, who'd always preached silence and caution, had spoken too loudly. Still, in Sinaloa, the legend grew. Kids wore shirts with his face. Corridos updated their lyrics to include the tunnel, the motorcycle, the shower blind spot. In villages where trust in government was thinner than dust, Chapo's escape was seen as proof that the state could be mocked and beaten. And then came the military. Raids swept the countryside. Gunships circled. The Navy flooded dirt roads with boots, and Guzmán, ever the tactician, began to retreat. Deeper, quieter, smaller. No more interviews, no more messages, just movement. But even he knew the radius was closing. Because you can build a tunnel through stone and steel, but you can't tunnel through a signal tower. And once the Watchers had your rhythm, they only needed time. So what do you think? Did Chapo fly too close to the sun? Or was it simply inevitable? He had escaped prison through a mile-long tunnel under the feet of the state. But this time, the soil beneath him was no longer safe. And somewhere, maybe even he knew, there wouldn't be a third. The dust hadn't even settled from the tunnel escape when the gears of retaliation began to grind. Joaquín Guzmán may have disappeared into the folds of the Sierra Madre, but the storm he left behind roared through Mexico like a thunderclap. His freedom wasn't just a logistical failure, it was a political disaster. And like any crisis, it demanded a show of force. Within days, the Mexican government, under pressure from both domestic outrage and foreign embarrassment, launched Operation Black Swan, a manhunt unlike any in recent history. Hundreds of Mexican Marines were deployed across Sinaloa and its neighboring states, supported by intelligence from the DEA, FBI, and CIA. Satellite imaging, intercepted phone signals, drone sweeps. Guzmán's escape was treated with the same urgency as a high-level terrorist. But here's the thing, Joaquín didn't respond with firepower. He responded with silence. You see, while the military kicked in doors and seized caches of weapons and cash, Guzmán vanished into the folds of the terrain he knew better than any map could draw. His childhood mountains, his ancestral dirt, places where loyalty didn't come from bribes, but from bloodlines, safe houses connected by footpaths, tunnels that twisted under goat trails. Men who'd known him since he was El Chapito, running barefoot with a slingshot and a dream. And here's a historical detail often overlooked. Sinaloa's terrain is not only rugged, but designed by nature to protect the patient. Mountains shield, ravines hide, and most importantly, locals there trust their own more than any uniform. But even the hills couldn't hide him forever. As pressure mounted, the government began targeting his allies. One by one, safe houses were raided, cousins arrested, complicit officials quietly removed. In Culiacán, Guzmán's family compound was surrounded, and although he wasn't there, the message was clear. This time, the net had no holes. And still, Guzmán didn't retaliate with guns. He tightened the circle, moved in silence, operated like vapor. But even the Tunnel King couldn't completely suppress the ripple effect. Cartel lieutenants, sensing his position weakening, began recalibrating their loyalty. Some leaned more heavily on El Mayo Zambada, still elusive, still respected. Others saw an opportunity to carve out new fiefdoms. In the shadows, whispers of succession began to stir. At the same time, rival organizations seized the moment. CJNG, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, expanded rapidly. Bold, militarized, social media savvy. They filled the vacuum Guzmán left, not with elegance or engineering, but with explosions and theatrics. And suddenly, the Sinaloa cartel wasn't just dodging government forces. It was dodging competition. Even in retreat, Chapo was forced to manage. Messages were sent through trusted couriers, never phones. Routes were altered. Prices were adjusted. Orders were trimmed down to minimize risk. But there was one card he hadn't accounted for: betrayal. Do you remember El Cholo, Ivan? Omar Trevino Morales, known as El Cholo, was one of Guzmán's top security chiefs. Bold, loyal, but also impatient. As heat increased, Guzmán leaned on him more and more for mobility and protection. But increased proximity meant increased exposure. On January 8, 2016, After nearly 6 months on the run, a tip came in. Guzmán was spotted in Los Mochis, Sinaloa, holed up in a safe house with El Cholo Ivan and a handful of guards. Mexican Marines descended before dawn. It wasn't quiet. The firefight tore through the house. Windows shattered. Walls crumbled. 5 of Guzmán's men were killed. 2 Marines wounded. Guzmán and El Cholo fled through a secret tunnel, of course. But this time, the end didn't lead to freedom. It led to a sewer, then a manhole, then a stolen vehicle, then a patrol. Cornered on the road by a routine stop, Guzmán tried to talk his way out. "Soy Joaquín," he reportedly said, as if there were still any doubt. No violence, no last stand, just a man who knew when the road had run out. He and El Cholo were taken without further incident. By nightfall, news broke across every screen in Mexico. El Chapo captured, again, and this time, there was no smug grin, no jokes, just a look of tired inevitability. Because many people still think he knew, really knew. This was the last escape attempt. So what do you think? Was he defeated, or simply done running? Back at Altiplano, the staff didn't need reminding. His cell had been modified. No blind spots, no showers with hidden doors, no guards he could bribe. And on the U.S. side of the border, a flurry of paperwork began moving with unprecedented speed. The Americans weren't going to let him tunnel out again, and neither, it seemed, would Mexico. If the first capture had been dramatic, and the second an embarrassment, the third was clinical, surgical, as if the entire machine of international law enforcement had finally synced its gears and squeezed the breath from the last open tunnel. But for Joaquín Guzmán, the man who once moved in shadows and spoke through silence, it wasn't the gunfight in Los Mochis or the flooded sewer that stung. It was what came next. The extradition. He'd fought it for years, weaving legal arguments through a web of appeals, delays, and jurisdictional debates. His lawyers argued that he wouldn't receive a fair trial in the United States, that conditions in American prisons were inhumane, that Mexico's sovereignty was being undermined. But none of it mattered, because the public had already judged him, the governments had already signed, and the world had already watched him disappear into the ground too many times. On January 19, 2017, just one day before Donald Trump was sworn in as President of the United States, Guzmán was transferred. Let that timing sink in. One final show of resolve from the Peña Nieto administration. One last symbolic gesture for an incoming American president who had made border control and cartel violence a campaign cornerstone. The plane touched down in Long Island, New York. There were no cameras, no public reception, just a quiet convoy of unmarked vehicles waiting to transport him to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. His new world was stark, a cell the size of a closet. No contact with the outside world, limited visitation, no access to natural light, and 23 hours a day of isolation. For a man who once moved thousands of people, who'd crossed mountains and tunneled beneath nations, this was the end of the map. And yet, he didn't resist. Some said he looked relieved. Others said he looked old. But one thing was certain, he no longer looked invincible. Inside the MCC, his every move was monitored. His meals were passed through a slot. Conversations with his lawyers were recorded. When he walked to court, he was flanked by U.S. Marshals. When he blinked, someone was counting the seconds. But even here, the myth persisted. The guards whispered. The press waited. Every motion filed by his defense was devoured by reporters. His wife, Emma Coronel Aispuro, attended the hearings, stoic, polished, like the last rose in a crumbling palace. And then came the moment that would change it all. Sean Penn's article. You remember the interview, don't you? The jungle meeting. The selfies, the coded messages, the briefcase full of arrogance. What had once seemed like a PR stunt now became a crucial link in the prosecution's timeline. Guzmán's own desire to be seen, to shape his legacy perhaps, had cracked open the final trail. The feds now had something rare, a digital breadcrumb left by the man himself. Text messages were recovered. Photos were authenticated. Conversations translated and scrutinized. And those pieces, sloppy, human, damning, would become part of the foundation for his trial. A trial, mind you, that felt less like prosecution and more like dissection, witness after witness. Some from within his own circle. Others who had long since turned state's evidence. They didn't just testify about drugs. They testified about dinners, about meetings, about moments so intimate they felt like betrayal in slow motion. One spoke of a murder ordered with a head nod, another of a bribe disguised as a birthday gift. One even testified that Guzmán had ordered the burial of an enemy alive. An anecdote told not with drama, but with the slow, painful detail of a man trying to lessen his own sentence. And through it all, Guzmán listened, expressionless, occasionally whispering to his lawyers, never yelling, never flinching, just listening, like a man who'd heard his name too many times to react. Many people still think that he was set up by those closest to him, that he was too isolated by then to be truly operational. So, what do you think? Was El Chapo still pulling strings in 2017? Or had he become, by then, just a symbol for others to hide behind? Because while he sat in a courtroom cage, the Sinaloa cartel adapted. Los Chapitos, his sons, tightened their grip. El Mayo moved more quietly than ever. Territories shifted, but the shipments kept flowing. Even locked away, Guzmán's name still scared people, still drew loyalty, still cast shadows over border towns and port cities. But for the man himself, reality had shrunk. The only tunnels now were courtroom hallways. The only shipments were documents slid across a table. The only thing that still moved at his command was memory. By the time Joaquín Guzmán's trial formally began in late 2018, the courtroom had transformed into a theater. Glass-walled, fortified, silent, but heavy with the weight of years. The government had been building its case for over a decade. And now, the world leaned forward in its seat. The charges against him read like a checklist from a war log. International drug trafficking, money laundering, illegal firearms possession, murder conspiracy. 10 counts in total. But the real headline wasn't the number of accusations. It was the magnitude of the story that came with them. Over 14 cooperating witnesses were scheduled to testify. Former lieutenants, traffickers, accountants, even one ex-lover. Each of them armed with memory, motive, and, in many cases, audio tapes. To avoid risk, the jury was kept anonymous and under armed escort. Even the judge, Brian Cogan, noted that security measures were unprecedented. No other defendant in recent U.S. criminal history had been afforded or warranted such treatment. And Guzmán? He sat each day in a tailored suit, clean-shaven, expression unreadable. Sometimes he smiled at his wife. Sometimes he simply stared ahead. He knew when to play stillness like a card. One of the first major witnesses was Jesus El Rey Zambada, brother of El Mayo. He described bribes paid to Mexican officials, routes used to fly cocaine into the U.S., and even explained the mechanics of loading drugs into oil tankers. Each testimony, while specific, felt like a tile in a mosaic. When seen together, they revealed the face of a system that Guzmán had allegedly mastered. Then came Damaso Lopez, a former close associate who'd once helped Chapo escape from Puente Grande. His betrayal hit differently. He wasn't just a partner. He was part of the story. Someone who had eaten from Guzmán's table, protected his children, buried his secrets, and now he poured them out one after the other. Do you remember how obsessed Chapo was with detail? Lopez described encrypted phones smuggled in hollowed-out shoes, meeting rooms with double exits, orders given with a nod, never a word. If true, these weren't just anecdotes. They were habits hardened into operational doctrine. But perhaps the most surreal moment came with the testimony of Lucero Guadalupe Sanchez Lopez, a former legislator from Sinaloa and reportedly one of Guzmán's lovers. She took the stand trembling, remembering the time she accompanied him through a narrow tunnel while soldiers raided the house above. He was a man of power, she said, but he was always watching the clock. Powerful phrase, because many people still think Guzmán wasn't driven by greed or even fear, but by control. So what do you think? Did he crave wealth? Or the timing of everything landing where it should? Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, a different kind of war was playing out. The media called it El Chapo Theater. Crowds lined up for seats. Sketch artists tried to capture expressions he rarely showed. Reporters filled columns with breakdowns of his wardrobe, his posture, even the nod he gave his wife each morning. Emma Coronel became a presence all her own. Fashionable, composed, loyal. She sat quietly through every hearing, her gaze never drifting far from her husband. At times, she even smiled. At other times, she clenched her hands like someone willing herself still. There were leaks, too. Brief moments where wiretaps revealed not just strategy, but sentiment. In one recording, Guzmán scolds a courier for sloppy packaging. In another, he sends instructions to kill a rival over a missed shipment. The recordings were mundane and monstrous all at once, but the most damning evidence wasn't just words, it was structure. The prosecution laid out a web of shell companies, bank transactions, hidden airstrips, bribed officials, even crypto wallets. The Sinaloa cartel, they argued, wasn't chaos, it was corporate. And Guzmán? He was the CEO with blood on the balance sheets. The defense tried to deflect, of course. They claimed Guzmán was a scapegoat, that El Mayo Zambada was the real kingpin, that the witnesses were criminals trying to save their own skins. But the weight of testimony was relentless. And Chapo, the man who had once climbed out of a maximum security prison, now had no place to stand. On February 12, 2019, after 6 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts. The courtroom was silent. Guzmán didn't speak, didn't react, didn't ask for sympathy. He simply nodded, because deep down, maybe even he knew, there would be no tunnels out of this one. Guilty on all counts. It landed not like a surprise, but like the final echo of a drum everyone had heard beating for years. On February 12, 2019, the U.S. judicial system put an end to one of the most publicized and mythologized chapters in the history of organized crime. Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, the man who once vanished through prison floors, walked away from gunfights, and disappeared under international pressure, was now irrevocably contained. The sentencing came 5 months later, July 17, 2019. Life in prison, plus 30 years, plus restitution, plus the forfeiture of $12.6 billion, an amount symbolic more than literal. Because while Guzmán was undoubtedly one of the wealthiest criminals in history, the true value of his operations wasn't something a ledger could hold. It lived in whispered roots, in corrupted systems, in memories that outlived money. The judge was firm, the prosecutors triumphant, and the public curious. Because even in conviction, Chapo's story refused to dissolve. Do you remember when he walked into that New York courtroom for the final time? He wore a charcoal gray suit. He looked thinner, older, not broken, but folded. When asked if he had anything to say, he didn't beg. He didn't explain. Instead, he calmly denounced the U.S. prison system, said it was cruel, said his isolation was torture, said justice had not been blind, but vindictive. And then he turned, walked, no drama, no final nod to his wife. Just the sound of a man being walked out of a world that would never mention his name with power again. Or so they hoped, because what happened next was not the end, but the beginning of something stranger. His transfer to ADX Florence, the so-called Alcatraz of the Rockies, was quiet, sudden, and extremely secure. No media caravan, no farewell to New York. Just a flight in the dead of night, and a van ride to a facility built to erase men like him from the map. ADX is designed for silence. Inmates spend 23 hours a day in solitary. Cells made of poured concrete, windows the width of a sheet of paper, beds bolted to floors, meals slid through slots. Conversation? Rare. Contact? Non-existent. Here's your mainstream historical fact. ADX houses the most dangerous, notorious, and isolated inmates in the federal system. Terrorists, serial killers, and now, the most infamous drug trafficker Mexico ever produced. Guzmán's world shrank overnight, from the jungles of Sinaloa to a space smaller than his old tunnel entrances, from commanding armies of couriers to watching concrete crack as his only entertainment. Many people still think this was the only way to truly contain him, that traditional imprisonment couldn't do it, that if left in Mexico, he would have escaped again. So what do you think? Was it justice or containment by desperation? But while Guzmán was locked away, his name was anything but still. The Sinaloa cartel didn't collapse. If anything, it evolved. El Mayo Zambada remained free. His sons, Los Chapitos, began asserting more control. Ivan, Jesus Alfredo, and Ovidio, each one more digitally fluent, more social media savvy, more volatile than their father. They lived publicly, flaunted wealth, posted cryptic photos. And in October 2019, the world watched as chaos exploded in Culiacán after Mexican forces tried to arrest Ovidio Guzmán Lopez. The city burned. Gunmen blocked roads, seized intersections, and forced the government into retreat. It was a display of power that sent a clear message. The myth of Chapo was not buried. It had multiplied. And back in Colorado, in that silent cube, Guzmán must have heard the news. Maybe not directly, but word travels, even behind walls. Maybe he allowed himself a smirk. Maybe he simply closed his eyes and let memory do what walls could not. Because you remember the boy from Latuna, right? The one who sold oranges and stared out at dirt roads as trucks rumbled through the hills. He hadn't dreamed of tunnels or planes or suits. He'd dreamed of more, and now there was nothing left to count. No shipments to time, no coordinates to send, only the sound of his own breathing in a space that never changes. But outside, the cartel breathes on. It fragments, reforms, swells in some regions, hides in others. It doesn't need Guzmán to operate, because it was never just about one man. It was about what he built, a structure that lived in the soil, in the silence, in the habit of movement. His empire may be leaderless, or perhaps not. Maybe El Mayo still sends quiet orders. Maybe the suns take the wheel. Or maybe Sinaloa has always functioned like a current, changing surface, same direction. One thing is certain. The extradition didn't end the war. It only shifted the weight, and in his concrete cage, El Chapo watches time pass, not in hours, but in dust. You might expect a man like Joaquín Guzmán, who once dictated schedules down to the minute, who escaped from prisons with surgical precision, who made governments look foolish with a tunnel and a motorcycle, to decay quickly when the silence sets in. But in ADX Florence, time doesn't rot you. It preserves you in stillness. Each morning begins the same. Lights on at 5 a.m. A tray of food slid through the slot. No human voice to greet it. The concrete walls are smooth, cold, and unchanging. There are no windows that face outward. The 4-inch slit in the wall gives light, but never shows sky. Even the air smells neutral, recycled, filtered, empty. For the first time since he was a child in Latuna, Guzmán is surrounded by a world he cannot bend. His only human interaction comes during the rare legal visit or the brief, tightly controlled stroll in the recreation cell. A slightly larger box with a metal grate overhead instead of a roof. It's here that he can feel a fragment of the sky. Not see it, but feel it. The change in temperature, the whisper of wind, the hint of moisture before it rains. He doesn't write, doesn't read much. When he does speak, it's brief, polite, sometimes wistful. He asked once if the sun still hit the hills of Badiraguato the same way in the early mornings. No one answered. This is not torture in the cinematic sense. There's no violence, no beatings. But it is a kind of disappearance that walks around you while you're still breathing. You remember that phrase the prosecutor used in court. The most dangerous man in the Western Hemisphere. Now, he's the most isolated. More than 800 miles from the nearest Sinaloan trail. The man who once ran a global drug empire can't even pick his own meal. His wife, Emma Coronel, was later arrested and sentenced to 3 years for her role in facilitating communications and trafficking within the cartel. When the sentence came down, she nodded, just as Joaquín had when the verdict was read in Brooklyn. 2 lives, shackled not just by love, but by logistics. And the sons, they remain free, at least most of them. Ovidio was arrested in 2023 after a second high-stakes operation in Culiacán. But the power of Los Chapitos endures. Each son commands his own cadre. Each one holds parts of the inheritance. Some say they're more reckless. Others say they're more ruthless. All agree they're not their father, because Guzmán, for all his brutality, was methodical, disciplined. His violence was surgical, not theatrical. His power was quiet, not boastful. Where his sons flash watches on social media, Chapo once buried gold in milk cans and memorized routes rather than writing them down. There's a myth, maybe true, maybe not, that he once said, "The more noise you make, the easier it is for the storm to find you." Now he makes none, but outside the storm hasn't passed. The Sinaloa cartel continues to supply a staggering portion of the drugs that enter the United States. Cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, and increasingly fentanyl. It's no longer about stacks of wrapped bricks in trucks. Now it's about milligrams that can slip into packages the size of postage stamps. It's an evolution, but the ghost of Guzmán's system still drives it. Routes he mapped, methods he tested, philosophies he insisted upon. And his legend? It grows in places where legend has value. In villages across Sinaloa, his name is still sung in corridos. Murals still bloom on cracked walls. showing his face beside saints and martyrs. His story is told to children not as warning, but as cautionary folklore. The man who beat prisons, who built roads when none were offered, who gave when the state took. Many people still think he never truly lost, that disappearing behind American walls is not defeat, but retreat, that somewhere, in some dusty corridor of the cartel, his whispers still echo. So what do you think? Did he truly vanish? Or did the walls just change shape? Because sometimes, silence isn't the absence of power. It's the sound it makes when it lies waiting. In the long shadow cast by Joaquín Guzmán's incarceration, something peculiar happened. His absence became a form of presence. Like the echo of a closing door, his story continued to shape decisions made by people who never met him, policies drafted in countries he never set foot in, and operations executed by a cartel he no longer controlled. You might think that with a figure like El Chapo removed from the game board, the pieces would scatter. But instead, they reorganized. The Sinaloa cartel didn't collapse. It morphed, and its evolution offers an uncanny reflection of the structure he built. Think about it. Guzmán didn't just run operations, he systematized criminality. Smuggling routes were tiered like supply chains. Territories functioned like franchises. Bribery was tracked and budgeted like marketing expenses. He didn't need to be present to keep the machinery turning. And so, even with his voice silenced, his methods lived on. Enter the era of Los Chapitos. Ivan, Jesus Alfredo, and Ovidio didn't inherit an empire in the traditional sense. They inherited a framework, one engineered for survival, one that knew how to shift weight when pressure came down. Each son adapted in his own way. Ivan ruled with paranoia, Jesus with calculation. Ovidio, before his arrest, blended a kind of digital age swagger with cold logistics. They weren't like their father. They weren't obsessed with tunnels. They weren't hands-on, but they understood momentum. And elsewhere, El Mayo Zambada, the phantom co-founder, remained untouched, still free, still untried, still the invisible hand moving chess pieces through whispers and money wires. You remember when Chapo first began running shipments under Gallardo's umbrella? How he was quiet, punctual, efficient. Now those same traits echo through Sinaloa's operations, though the voices have changed, but the ecosystem around them hasn't gotten easier. In fact, it's gotten worse. Here's a critical historical fact. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid up to 50 times more potent than heroin, became the new flagship of the cartel's export list during the post-Chapo years. Cheap to make, easy to conceal, and devastating in even tiny quantities, fentanyl redefined trafficking. It also redrew attention from international agencies. Suddenly, the war on drugs wasn't about plants anymore. It was about chemistry, about labs hidden in valleys, precursor shipments routed through Asia, and overdoses counted in the thousands across the United States. And yet, many of those labs followed a blueprint Chapo once laid down: minimize risk, maximize yield, and never be visible. It's no coincidence that DEA reports still name the Sinaloa cartel as the most powerful drug organization in the world. Nor is it an accident that they still refer to El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel as if his name were a watermark across every shipment. But if the world expected things to get better without him, they were wrong. The power vacuum didn't result in peace. It led to splinters, internal strife, the rise of new players, the intensification of old rivalries. CJNG, the Jalisco New Generation cartel, grew bolder. Border towns turned into battlegrounds, and violence escalated. Because without Chapo's controlling hand, some say, the rules grew loose. Do you remember the structure he once imposed? Meetings that started on time. killings that served a purpose, alliances maintained like contracts. Now, younger bosses bring chaos. They tweet threats. They film executions. They seek fame instead of silence. Many people still think the drug war got messier after Chapo was captured, not cleaner. So what do you think? Did removing the kingpin fix the board, or just break the rhythm? One thing is clear. The US-Mexico drug dynamic didn't slow. It accelerated. Trade routes remained open. Bribes still passed. And on both sides of the border, lives continued to vanish in silence. And through it all, Guzmán remains untouched by time. In Florence, his days blur. His cell doesn't change. No new stories come from inside. And yet, his name still gets stamped on breaking news headlines, like a brand that can't be scrubbed. Outside, the legend mutates. Some see him as a cautionary tale, others a folk hero. Politicians name drop him in speeches. Musicians write him into songs. His face, smiling under a cap, still sells bootleg t-shirts in Culiacan. But the man walks in circles. And maybe that's the true shape of the story now. A loop. A structure still moving, long after the builder sat down. There's something haunting about the way Joaquín Guzmán's name continues to echo. Like a frequency too low to hear, but one you can still feel. Not just in news reports or legal filings, but in the quiet calculations of those who stepped into the gaps he left behind. Even now, years after his sentencing, officials across the Americas still refer to cartel blueprints in terms of how Chapo would have done it. Not because they admire him, but because no one optimized the process of illegal logistics quite like he did. And yet, for all that systemic mastery, the world he left behind has grown more volatile, not less. Inside Mexico, the Sinaloa cartel splintered, not destructively, but organically, like a hydra shedding one head and sprouting three more. The factions under Los Chapitos, El Mayo Zambada, and other regional commanders began carving out their own rules, sometimes cooperating, sometimes clashing. But what remained unchanged was the spine of it all, the architecture Chapo laid out during his decades in power. Let's explore one of those structures, the plaza system. Under Guzmán, each territory, or plaza, functioned as a semi-autonomous unit, overseen by a trusted lieutenant who managed trafficking routes, enforced loyalty, and paid dues up the ladder. It was clean, efficient, even elegant in a ruthless kind of way. Today, those plazas still exist, but the lines are blurrier, the loyalties more fragile. Upstarts use Chapo's name to command respect. Enemies invoke it to justify violence. His ghost, in many ways, provides cover for all kinds of maneuvering. And meanwhile, fentanyl continues to reshape the battleground. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By 2022, over 70,000 Americans were dying each year from synthetic opioid overdoses, primarily fentanyl. Much of it traced back to Mexico. And according to multiple reports, the Sinaloa cartel remains one of the primary suppliers, not just because they can, but because Chapo once made sure they knew how. And this is where the debate intensifies. Was Guzmán a genius of underworld economics, or simply the luckiest man in a fractured system? Many people still think he was inevitable. That in a country where poverty grinds down generations and corruption corrodes from the top, someone like Chapo was always going to rise. So what do you think? Was he an anomaly or a product? Back in Florence, he's silent on the matter. His day begins the same. Lights on, tray in. The air is cold, the concrete unchanged. He is 5'6", 66 years old, and no longer permitted to touch the outside world. His hair has thinned, his back aches, The man who once darted through tunnels and crossed mountain ridges on foot now shuffles in socks across 7 feet of floor. Still, even in stillness, his presence endures. In pop culture, his story is legend. Netflix turned his life into a binge-worthy character arc. Books dissect his rise. Podcasts argue over the moral dimension of his decisions. In song, he's a myth. In prisons across Mexico, his name gets spoken like a warning. Even in government offices, files marked with his initials are still pulled from drawers when new cases are built. His organization may have evolved, but its fingerprints remain everywhere, from the docks of Manzanillo to the stash houses of Chicago. And his family? Emma Coronel was released from U.S. custody in 2023 after serving time. She kept quiet. No press tours, no tell-all interviews. Her silence, much like his, became a statement of its own. The Suns continue to operate in the crosshairs. Ovidio's second arrest in 2023 sparked another wave of violence in Sinaloa, including open battles in the streets and civilian hostages used as shields. The message was clear. This bloodline still matters. Even U.S. officials, who once declared victory when Guzmán was sentenced, now tread carefully when speaking about Sinaloa, because while the man may be gone, the machinery hums louder than ever. So where does the story go from here? Is this where the legend ends? A concrete cell? A legacy held by others? A myth carved into corridor lyrics and policy papers? Or is it still unfolding? Quietly, beneath headlines, beneath policy briefings, beneath the silence of one very still man in one very cold room. Because do you remember what made Chapo truly dangerous? It wasn't the guns, or the drugs, or even the tunnels. It was that he never rushed. He waited, calculated, moved when others slept. And now, though he's still... the empire he built, it hasn't blinked. By now, the image of Joaquín Guzmán has hardened into something surreal. Part criminal, part cautionary tale, part phantom carved into history. But the world hasn't let him go. His name still sells headlines. His face still anchors narratives. His myth, intentionally or not, remains monetized. And behind that myth, a deeply structured reality. Because whether you admire or despise him, El Chapo didn't stumble into power. He designed it. And what made him singular was not just his grip on territory, but on movement. Movement of product, movement of people, movement of information. He turned trafficking into choreography, drug routes into arteries, and timing into an art form. Everything he did was organized around flow. Keep the weight moving. Keep the cash invisible. Keep the noise elsewhere. And for a long time it worked. But now, the gears turn without him. And that raises a question. What happens to a machine when the mechanic vanishes? Let's look at the numbers. Sinaloa, as a cartel, continues to operate across more than 50 countries. Its reach extends into Asia, Europe, Africa, and nearly every major U.S. city. Cocaine remains a pillar. Meth continues to surge. Fentanyl has become the new crown jewel. And guess what? The infrastructure for all of it, labs, smuggling corridors, safe houses, money laundering mechanisms, still follows the same skeletal map Chapo refined. It's almost as if he's still there, giving orders. Only now, the orders come from echoes, from muscle memory, from protocol etched into every lieutenant's gut. Meanwhile, the political landscape around him keeps shifting. In the U.S., fentanyl dominates the drug policy conversation. Congressional hearings name-drop Guzmán, even though he's been sealed off for years. Narco documentaries still open with his silhouette. And DEA agents still reference Chapo routes when tracking new movements along the Arizona and Texas borders. In Mexico, he's become both a symbol and a scapegoat. Politicians run on promises to defeat cartels once and for all, while quietly negotiating terms of peace in regions too fragile for open war. Community leaders blame the void left after his arrest for the new generation's chaos. Bosses without restraint, violence without structure, ambition without brakes, and then there are the tunnels. Even now, Customs and Border Patrol continue to discover underground passages along the U.S.-Mexico border. Some abandoned, some still warm, most eerily similar to the ones Guzmán favored. Deep, narrow, precise, functional, like chapters in an unfinished manuscript. You remember his obsession with timing? It wasn't just about shipments, it was about legacy. He built things to last, not for him, but for after him. It's why lieutenants didn't just learn routes, they learned philosophy, silence over spectacle, efficiency over ego, and yet the world changed. His sons, though ruthless, play by a louder set of rules. They engage in digital warfare, flash cash online, mock their enemies in memes. The old codes of discretion, of discipline, are cracking. The new cartel wars are louder, messier, more cinematic. And that makes the older generation, men like El Mayo, and even remnants of the Beltran Leyva organization, nervous. Because when Chapo ran things, the violence had purpose. It served a timeline. It made the next delivery easier. Now, there's violence for its own sake. Flash without plan. Killings that make headlines instead of openings. So what do you think? Was Guzmán a villain? Or the last disciplined one? A tyrant? Or a necessary control in a system gone feral? Many people still think the cartel world was more predictable with him in it. Not better, just clearer. And perhaps that's the strangest twist of all, that a man responsible for unimaginable harm, for thousands of deaths and billions in poison, could be missed. Not for who he was, but for what he prevented by being the center of gravity. But the world has moved on. Inside ADX Florence, the days grow longer. The lights hum on schedule. The silence, once a choice, is now a life sentence. And outside, his story becomes a franchise. Books, series, songs, government reports, academic papers, all trying to define a man who never wanted to be seen. His legacy, still moving, still shifting weight, still leaving behind maps others follow, even if they no longer know who drew them. And maybe that's the final irony, that the man who once vanished into a tunnel beneath a prison now exists in everything built to replace him. This is where it all converges, not in the blaze of a gunfight, or the hum of a tunnel, or the ink of a headline, but in stillness, in the slow, unglamorous exhale of a story whose rhythms have finally softened. Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, once the architect of quiet revolutions beneath borders and bureaucracy, now spends his days in silence, measured by overhead fluorescent lights. He wakes when they wake him, sleeps when they allow it, eats what is given, speaks when spoken to, which is rare. The man who once kept entire countries guessing about his next move now has none left. But here's what makes that fact so strange. His presence hasn't disappeared. Not really. His legacy is coded into systems that still function. His name, though ghosted in court transcripts and redacted in government files, still directs conversations behind closed doors. He is a man removed from his empire, yet still stitched through its seams. In ADX Florence, the walls are made not just of steel and concrete, but of deliberate absence. It's engineered to erase movement, choice, power. But Guzmán, by sheer scale of what he once built, defies even that. His stillness means something. Even now, When law enforcement uncovers a new tunnel, deep under Otay Mesa or Calexico, they describe it as Chapo style. When a multi-ton shipment is seized in the Gulf of Mexico, journalists call it a Sinaloa playbook operation. When smaller cartels mimic his organization, analysts still trace their strategy back to the bones of what he built. Do you remember the corridos? The folk ballads once sung about him with swagger and brass? They're softer now, slower, more like elegies than anthems. And in those towns, he once ruled from the shadows. Badiraguato, Culiacan. People speak of him like a relative who's passed, not forgotten, not forgiven, just placed gently into the space that memory leaves behind. Yet many people still think he's not finished. So what do you think? Has the empire truly outlived the emperor, or is he still there, buried in the protocol of lieutenants who never knew him, but still call him Senor Guzmán out of habit? We may never know. And maybe that's the truest kind of legacy. Not carved in stone, but folded into function. Not declared in public, but humming beneath the surface, like a tunnel no one's found yet. And as the years stretch on inside that cell, as the sun moves past the Rockies without permission or pause, there's only one story left to tell. Not of escapes, not of killings, not of billions stacked in warehouses or mayors bought with envelopes, but of stillness. Because now, there's no more motion to measure, no more corridors to crawl, no more watchers left to outwit. Just time, long, wide, unbending, and a man who once built a kingdom underground, now buried above it all, in the silence he once used as a weapon. He does not speak, but everything he left behind still does. And now, as our story fades to quiet, let your thoughts drift. Not to the violence, not to the noise, but to the still places in between. Imagine that empty tunnel, deep beneath the earth, long abandoned but perfectly intact, the rails unmoving, the walls echoing with memories, not footsteps. It leads nowhere now, but it once led to freedom. Let that be the final image tonight. A corridor into the past, because sometimes the most dangerous man in the world doesn't leave behind a crater, but a whisper, a rhythm, a system that keeps walking long after the boots are gone. So wherever you are right now, whether it's midnight or morning peeking through the blinds, breathe slower. Let the air settle. Let the story sink beneath your skin like the last glow of candlelight. You've followed a man through the rise and fall of empires, through soil and steel, through silence and spectacle. And now, he rests, and so should you. Let the lights dim in your thoughts. Let the footsteps slow. Let the tunnels narrow into dreams, because the empire is quiet now, and the night is long, and this moment is yours.